What if the most important question in American politics right now is not whether you support Donald Trump or oppose him? What if the real question is much bigger? How much power should any president have when the institutions designed to restrain presidential power begin to weaken? That question has become more urgent because of a fundamental change in American constitutional law. In 2024, the Supreme Court ruled that a former president has absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for actions taken within his core constitutional powers, and at least presumptive immunity for other official acts. The court also made clear that unofficial conduct does not receive that protection. That distinction matters enormously. It does not mean a president can simply commit any crime without consequences. It does not mean the president is literally above every law. But it does raise a difficult question that constitutional scholars, political leaders, journalists, and ordinary Americans are still debating. Where exactly is the line? And what happens when presidential power, congressional authority, prosecutorial independence, military command, and national security all collide at the same time? I'm David Whitmore, and this is Breaking News Analysis. Today, we're going beyond the partisan shouting. We're going to separate what we know from what is alleged, what the Constitution actually says from what politicians say it says, and what critics of the Trump administration fear from what Trump's supporters believe he was elected to do. And we're going to examine the arguments associated with Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist David Cay Johnston, a longtime chronicler and fierce critic of Donald Trump. If you value fact-based political analysis that examines the argument and the evidence behind it, subscribe to the channel and join us. Because this story is ultimately not just about Donald Trump, it's about the presidency itself. Start with the basic constitutional structure. The American system was deliberately designed to make concentrated power difficult. Congress writes laws and controls appropriations. The president executes those laws and commands the executive branch. The courts interpret the law and resolve constitutional disputes, and each branch has tools that can restrain the others. That system has never worked perfectly. American history is filled with presidents who tested the boundaries of executive authority. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. Franklin Roosevelt dramatically expanded the federal government. Richard Nixon became the central figure in Watergate. Presidents from both parties expanded executive authority in national security, surveillance, immigration, and military operations. So conflict over presidential power is not new. What is different today is the combination of extraordinarily polarized politics, expansive presidential authority, weakened trust in institutions, and the Supreme Court's modern interpretation of presidential immunity. And that is where Johnston's warning becomes important. His argument, broadly speaking, is that Americans should not evaluate presidential power based only on whether they trust the person currently occupying the White House. They should ask what those same powers would look like in the hands of a president they profoundly distrust. That is a much harder test. Imagine that you strongly support President Trump. Now imagine the exact same legal powers being exercised by a future Democratic president whose agenda you consider dangerous. Would you still want those powers to be that broad? And the same question applies in reverse. If you're a Democrat who wants aggressive presidential action today, would you be comfortable giving a future Republican president the same authority? That's why constitutional rules matter. They outlive individual presidents. And this debate is unfolding while Americans are also confronting economic uncertainty. The administration has repeatedly emphasized economic strength and its broader vision for American prosperity. But economic performance is never captured by a campaign slogan. The Bureau of Economic Analysis reported that real GDP grew at an annual rate of 1.6% in the first quarter of 2026. That represented an acceleration from the final quarter of 2025, but the BEA also revised its initial first quarter estimate downward. That's important because political narratives often reduce the economy to one sentence. The economy is booming, or the economy is collapsing. Reality is almost always more complicated. You can have rising financial markets while individual households remain under pressure. You can have economic growth while particular industries struggle. You can have strong headline numbers while consumers remain deeply concerned about prices, housing, debt, or employment. And politicians of both parties naturally emphasize whichever indicators support their argument. So when we hear sweeping claims about a new golden age or equally sweeping claims about economic catastrophe, our job is not to choose the slogan we prefer. Our job is to examine the numbers. That same discipline becomes even more important in foreign policy. Consider the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway is not merely a regional concern. It is one of the world's most strategically important energy corridors. A serious disruption there can affect shipping, insurance costs, energy markets, inflation expectations, military calculations, and relations between Washington and governments across the Gulf. And in a crisis like this, presidential power becomes extraordinarily consequential. The president has enormous authority over diplomacy and military operations. But Congress also possesses constitutional powers involving war, funding, legislation, and oversight. The tension between those responsibilities has existed for generations. The modern question is whether Congress is still willing and able to exercise its side of that constitutional bargain. Supporters of a strong executive make a serious argument here. They say international crises move too quickly for government by committee. A president may have minutes or hours to respond to an attack. Intelligence may be incomplete. Military opportunities may disappear. Allies may need immediate reassurance. Adversaries may interpret hesitation as weakness. From that perspective, a powerful presidency is not necessarily an authoritarian presidency. It can be a practical requirement of leading a global superpower. That argument deserves to be heard, but the opposing argument deserves equal attention. If emergency authority becomes normal authority, and if Congress repeatedly declines to assert its constitutional role, temporary presidential power can become structurally permanent. And that is where the institutional question becomes more important than the individual president. Who says no? Who demands evidence? Who controls the money? Who investigates mistakes? Who determines whether an emergency is actually an emergency? And what happens when the people responsible for answering those questions believe their careers depend primarily on maintaining the president's personal confidence? This brings us to one of the most controversial aspects of the Trump presidency: loyalty. Trump supporters argue that previous administrations became dependent on a permanent Washington bureaucracy that could frustrate the agenda of an elected president. From their perspective, replacing resistant officials is not an assault on democracy. It is democracy. Their argument is straightforward. Donald Trump won an election. Voters chose his agenda. The executive branch ultimately answers to the elected president, and a president cannot realistically implement that agenda while surrounded by senior officials who oppose it. That position has constitutional weight. The president is the head of the executive branch and has substantial appointment and removal authority, but critics, including Johnston, focus on a different danger. There is a distinction between demanding loyalty to an administration's lawful policy objectives and demanding personal loyalty to the individual holding the presidency. That distinction can become especially important at the Department of Justice, the intelligence agencies, and the Pentagon. A political advisor is expected to advance the president's political program. A prosecutor is expected to follow the law. An intelligence analyst is expected to tell policymakers what the evidence indicates, including when that evidence is politically inconvenient. And a military officer's oath is to the Constitution. Those roles overlap with presidential authority, but they are not identical. This is why personnel decisions inside national security institutions deserve scrutiny without automatically assuming sinister motives. Presidents are entitled to choose senior officials. Elections have consequences, but Americans are also entitled to ask whether expertise, institutional independence, and the willingness to deliver unwelcome information are being preserved. Because intelligence becomes dangerous when leaders receive only the intelligence they want to hear. History has repeatedly demonstrated that bad intelligence can start wars. Politicized intelligence can hide threats. Groupthink can convince leaders that adversaries will behave exactly as expected. And personal loyalty can become especially hazardous when military decisions are involved. The stakes are not abstract. A president making a decision involving Iran, China, Russia, North Korea, or another nuclear-armed or strategically significant power is operating in an environment where one miscalculation can affect millions of people. That does not mean military leadership should be beyond civilian control. Quite the opposite. Civilian control of the military is a foundational American principle. The president is commander-in-chief. But civilian control works best when professional military officers can provide candid assessments before elected leaders make the final decision. The president should make the decision. The advisors should tell the president what they genuinely believe. Those two principles can coexist. And when they stop coexisting, the quality of decision-making can deteriorate rapidly. This is why I think the most useful way to understand the current controversy is not through the question, is Trump a dictator? That question immediately pushes Americans into opposing political camps. A more useful question is this: are the institutions around the presidency becoming stronger or weaker? Can Congress still effectively investigate the executive branch? Can courts issue decisions the administration will obey? Can prosecutors make decisions based on evidence rather than political pressure? Can inspectors general investigate misconduct? Can intelligence officials deliver assessments that contradict the president's public position? Can military leaders provide unwelcome advice without believing that disagreement itself will end their careers? And can journalists expose wrongdoing without government retaliation? Those are measurable questions, and they would matter regardless of whether the president were Donald Trump, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, or somebody whose name we do not yet know. This brings us back to presidential immunity. The Supreme Court's ruling is often described in political conversation as though it declared the president completely above the law. It did not. The actual ruling is more complicated. The court recognized absolute immunity for the president's core constitutional powers, presumptive immunity for other official actions, and no immunity for unofficial acts. Supporters of the ruling argue that without substantial immunity, every president could face criminal prosecution from political opponents after leaving office. Imagine a president ordering a controversial military operation and then facing prosecution years later because a new administration claims the decision was criminal. If presidents feared personal prosecution every time they exercised disputed constitutional authority, the argument goes they might become incapable of performing the job decisively. That was central to the constitutional concern addressed by the court. Critics see a different danger. They worry that broad immunity could make accountability extraordinarily difficult when potentially criminal conduct is intertwined with official presidential responsibilities. And that creates a constitutional paradox. The presidency must be powerful enough to function, but it cannot become so insulated that meaningful accountability disappears. There's no easy answer to that problem, and pretending there is one does the audience a disservice. Congress is therefore crucial. Americans sometimes talk about the president as though the president alone constitutes the federal government. He does not. Congress can legislate. Congress controls federal appropriations. The Senate participates in confirmations. Congress can conduct oversight. Congress can subpoena witnesses subject to legal limitations and disputes. And the Constitution provides impeachment as the ultimate political mechanism for addressing serious presidential misconduct. But constitutional powers only matter when institutions are willing to use them. And here, partisan politics becomes the elephant in the room. Members of Congress do not operate outside politics. They need voters, they need donors, they need party support, they may fear primary challenges. And when the president dominates their political coalition, challenging that president can become personally costly. This phenomenon is not unique to Trump. Political parties have protected presidents from their own side throughout American history. But the stronger a president's hold over a party becomes, the more important congressional independence becomes. Because the Constitution did not create Congress merely to endorse presidential decisions. It created a separate branch. And this is one reason the debate over executive power cannot simply be reduced to whether Trump's policies are popular. A policy can be popular and still raise constitutional questions. A policy can be unpopular and still be constitutional. Those are different tests. Now look at Cuba. The Trump administration has significantly intensified pressure on the Cuban government. On May 1st, 2026, the White House announced additional sanctions targeting Cuban officials and entities it accused of repression, corruption, security threats, and support for hostile actors. The administration presents these measures as necessary to protect U.S. national security and hold the Cuban government accountable. Critics of sanctions argue that broad economic pressure can impose serious costs on ordinary citizens while failing to produce the political transformation Washington wants. Supporters counter that easing pressure without substantial reforms can strengthen an authoritarian government and reduce American leverage. Again, two competing arguments, and the responsibility of serious analysis is to examine both. The central question is effectiveness. What precisely is the objective? What would success look like? What are the unintended consequences? What happens if the strategy fails? And what mechanisms exist to change course? Those questions should apply to Cuba. They should apply to Iran. They should apply to sanctions. They should apply to military operations. And they should apply to every administration, because foreign policy becomes particularly dangerous when political leaders become more interested in appearing strong than in measuring whether a policy actually works. The same principle applies to the Department of Justice. The Justice Department occupies an unusual position. It belongs to the executive branch. The Attorney General is appointed by the President. The president has legitimate policy authority over the executive branch. But American democratic norms have also developed around the idea that individual criminal investigations should not simply become instruments for punishing political enemies or protecting political allies. That distinction is essential. There is nothing improper about prosecuting a politician who committed a crime. Political status cannot provide immunity from ordinary criminal law. But there is something profoundly dangerous about deciding first that a political opponent must be prosecuted and searching for a crime afterward. The evidence has to come first. The same standard must apply to Trump's opponents, and it must apply to Trump. That is what nobody is above the law actually requires. Not selective prosecution, not selective immunity, the same evidentiary standard, the same due process, the same constitutional protections. And that brings us to the larger warning behind Johnston's argument. Democratic erosion rarely arrives with a politician announcing that democracy is officially over. It can happen incrementally. A norm disappears here. An independent official is replaced there. Congress gives up another piece of authority. An emergency power becomes routine. A political opponent becomes an enemy of the state. An inconvenient fact becomes disloyalty. And eventually, people discover that institutions they assumed would always function independently no longer have the capacity or the willingness to do so. But there is another danger we need to acknowledge. Americans can also damage democracy by declaring every political disagreement authoritarian. If every controversial executive action is described as dictatorship, the word eventually loses meaning. If every personnel change is called a purge, serious abuses become harder to distinguish from ordinary presidential authority. If every disagreement with a court becomes a constitutional crisis, the public becomes numb when an actual constitutional crisis occurs. Precision matters, evidence matters, language matters, and credibility matters. That is why this conversation cannot simply become another anti-Trump monologue or pro-Trump defense. The real question is institutional. What powers should the presidency have? What powers should Congress reclaim? Where should prosecutorial independence begin and presidential control end? How should courts balance accountability with the president's constitutional responsibilities? And perhaps, most importantly, would you accept the same rules if the opposing political party controlled the White House tomorrow? That's the test I keep coming back to, because constitutional principles are easiest to defend when they hurt your opponent. They become meaningful when they restrain your own side. So where does America stand? The United States still has elections. It still has courts. It still has Congress. It still has an independent press. It still has civil society. It still has political opposition. And Americans remain free to criticize their government. Those facts matter, but institutions do not maintain themselves. Their strength depends on laws, norms, officials willing to enforce them, journalists willing to investigate them, and citizens willing to defend principles even when doing so becomes politically inconvenient. David Cay Johnston's warning should therefore be treated as an argument to investigate, not a conclusion Americans are required to accept. Trump's defenders should be heard, his critics should be heard, and then the evidence should be examined, because this is ultimately bigger than Donald Trump. Every precedent created today becomes available to the president who comes tomorrow. Every power Congress surrenders today may be difficult to recover later. Every expansion of presidential immunity affects future presidents. Every weakening of institutional independence changes the balance of the system. And every American, Republican, Democrat, independent, or politically exhausted has an interest in ensuring that the rules remain stronger than the person temporarily holding the office. So I want to leave you with one question. Forget for a moment whether you support Donald Trump. Forget whether you voted Republican or Democrat. Imagine the politician you trust least in America. Now give that person every presidential power you are comfortable giving your preferred candidate. Would you still consider the system safe? Tell me your answer in the comments. And if you value analysis that separates verified facts from allegations, arguments from evidence, and political rhetoric from constitutional reality, subscribe to Breaking News Analysis, like this report, and share it with someone who sees this issue differently than you do. I'm David Whitmore. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next report.